Welcome to this module on developing a web application using MVC. This is part 1. Okay. In the earlier module, we had seen what is MVC architecture. Fine. This module and the subsequent module, the two modules are meant for demonstrating how to develop a web application using MVC. Fine. In this module, what we will be doing is we will be identifying all the components which are needed for all the components which are needed here. Fine. We'll identify the components for the model, the components for the view, the components for the controller. Fine. We had seen that yes, when we use MVC for web applications, we will be having bean components which are used as model. Fine. We will be having business components which can be part of the model. We can have servlets going as the controller, and we will be having JSPs which are going to be used as the view components. Fine. And of course, for any web application, we always have our deployment descriptor in the form of a web.xml file. Fine. So, here are the various components which will be needed. Fine. We will have deployment descriptor web.xml, which is always so this is something which will be seeing. Fine. We will have the model components. Now, we are keeping this as a very simple web application. So, in this web application, we will have nothing but just 2 pages. We will have a login page, fine, and we will have a home page. And of course, from the home page, he should be able to log out and come back. Fine. For any web application, these 2 would always be there, and then you can have depending on whatever domain it is there, other kind of views may be developed. Fine. Other pages may be there. So, here fine. So, what we have identified here is a simple thing. We will have a user gets logged in. Whenever a user logs in, we will have to manage his session, we will have to keep track of the user, fine, and when he logs out, yes, we will try to forget the user. Okay. So, we have here what we have identified here is we have identified few model components. One is to manage information about the user who has logged in, fine. So, we will have a user info, a class called user info. We will have another class which will be used for the purpose of authentication. So, we have an authenticator, fine, and we will have another component in the model which will be the for showing messages, fine. When the login fails or anything happens, we have to show a message. So, we need a message bean, fine. So, those are the 3 components which have been identified for model. Then we have identified controller, then we have identified the view components. As I mentioned here, in this case we will just have 2 pages. So, we will have a login page and a home page. So, we will have 2 JSP files for the 2 pages here, fine. So, login.jsp, home.jsp, and then we will have the controllers. So, the controller components here are the servlets. We will have a servlet for login. Okay. We will have a servlet for logout. Now, something more we are trying to manage here is, what we are trying to manage here is, we have seen about session management, right. So, session management is one, and another thing is we would like to have cookies, right. We want to manage cookies also, we know how to manage cookies. Now, what we want here is, whenever someone does a login, when in the login page we give him an option that he wants to remember the user. And that is a very common thing, common feature. So, if he says he wants to remember the user, we would now remember that page, remember that this user has logged in, his credentials in terms of login ID and the password, that for this we would use a cookie and store them, fine. Now, when he does when he comes in next time, right, he should be able to log in directly. So, when he comes for the first time, when he says just the slash, he does not give the slash login or it does not give the full URL, but he identifies the application. So, when he just identifies and goes to the home of the application, what we will have is, we will have our own servlet which can do the checking for. So, in that case we can do the checking for whether this user has whether there are cookies for this user, and if there are cookies for the user, then we will be in that case we will be authenticating using the credentials found in the cookies. Fine. So, and therefore, what we want here is we will have also have a controller component called the welcome servlet. So, those are the 3 servlets we have identified. Okay. Fine. Just to show the interaction part. Okay. Let us see. Okay. So, more or less how the flow of the application is going to be, and what each of those components, where each of those component fits into our web application. Fine. So, what we are going to have is as a we can start first maybe with the controllers. Okay. So, what we intend here is our first controller, the first component which we may have is going to be a servlet, right. So, he interacts the user interacts with the servlet, and maybe the first component which he identifies could be, so he could be our, so we have a welcome servlet. Okay. Fine. So, that is where he hits first, right. So, when he interacts with the welcome servlet, when the user is, the first request comes to the welcome servlet, the checking for cookies can be done here. So, its role of this would be to check for cookies. If there are cookies, that means this user there is some user credentials already available, and there is a automatic login to be carried out. Fine. So, if there is a automatic login to be carried out, what we should be doing is we will have a login servlet. So, this actually extracts the credentials and submits the login request to a login servlet. So, one is a welcome servlet, another interaction where the user will be interacting is a login servlet. So, we will have a login servlet. Okay. The role of the login servlet. Now, what the role of the login servlet would be? The login servlet would be using the authenticator. Now, it goes and uses the model. So, components from the model are going to be used from the servlet. So, in this case our login servlet would be making use of a authenticator. Fine. It would make use of a authenticator, where the authenticator can just say whether the credentials, one is you submit credentials to the authenticator. So, we have a component for the authenticator, where the interaction, right. So, interaction here would be whether one interaction is to authenticate, and another interaction here would be he should be able to if he is authenticated, then getting the information about the user, that is another thing, right. So, a method to get user info, fine. So, get user info could be another method here. Okay. So, we will provide 2 methods at least in the authenticator, fine. The purpose is clear. One is to authenticate, it can return a boolean value whether this credential is correct or not, and other would be for getting the information about the user given his login ID. So, that is something which our login servlet is going to do. So, login servlet would be interacting with the authenticator, makes use of authenticator, but when he says get user info, the get user info is going to create object of a bean component, which is nothing but our. So, an object of user info would be created. Okay. So, user info object is going to be returned to the login servlet. Fine. So, the role of login servlet is first one of the thing login servlet is the one of the thing it has to do is first make an authentication. Another thing which it will have to do is if the credentials are not correct, fine, in that case it has to give a error message, and so from login servlet where does it go? If credentials are not correct, it has to direct to a JSP, that is a login JSP. Fine. It goes to the login JSP if credentials are fine. If credentials do not match, fine, not authenticated. So, if he is not authenticated, in that case, fine, it goes to login JSP. But if he is already authenticated, fine, if the credentials are good, fine, in that case, what it can do is it can again do one more checking. Fine, its role will be to check whether the user has requested to remember, fine, to remember his login credentials. If he has requested to remember the login credentials, then the login servlet is supposed to create cookies, fine, fine, it should store cookies on the server, and then, so whether cookies are stored, fine, but if the credentials are okay, then he is forwarded from here. So, if credentials are okay, he should be forwarded to another JSP, which is the home JSP. Okay. Fine. Now, what we have is, yes, if the user is going to the login JSP, on the login JSP, he is going to submit the details like login ID, password, and remember me, and he has a submit button. So, now whenever he uses a submit button here, and the login button, so on the login here, on the login he is always sent back to the, so on whenever he submits login, it is an interaction, the interaction would send it back to the login servlet. Fine. When someone says login, he has to go to the login servlet. Only case was, in case of a welcome, if cookies are found, then the credentials are not picked up from the user, but they are picked up from the cookies, and then those are submitted through login servlet. Okay, fine. Now, another thing is, if credentials are okay, he is going to the home JSP. From home JSP, yes, we can display all the details, but one of the important thing which we will have is a logout button. There will be a button for the logout, okay, or there can be a simple link for the logout. So, when he says sign out or logout, right, so at that point he is to be directed to, so this is when he is submitting that, the submission is done to, you can think of another controller here, and that controller is our logout servlet. Okay, fine. So, fine, and anyway, when he there is another component which is our message bean. The message bean is something which our login servlet is going to be using. The login servlet is going to use a message bean in order to display message. The messages are going to be displayed by login JSP. Fine. On the login JSP, a failure message, fine, that could be displayed here. So, for that, yes, to keep messages, we have a message bean. Okay. So, that gives an idea of what kind of components we are going to have in our, this is just an overview of the components which we will have in our web application. Fine. Now, in this module, we will be finishing with all the model components, that is, we are going to be developing 3 things here. Fine. In this module, we will have 3 things. One is the authenticator. Fine. These are the model components. So, we will have the authenticator, we will have the user info, and we will have the message bean. Okay. So, yes, this module will be covering these, and then in the next module, we will be continuing in the next module after that. So, we will start with the demo after this, and in that demo, we will be developing these things. And then in the next module, it will be a demo only, which will be covering about creating the web application side. This is model side. So, then we will have the web application side, which is mainly going to be on, for web application, we will have the following components. One is in web application, the deployment descriptor, so web.xml. Okay. Fine, that would be important for us, and the other components. So, we will have the servlets and the JSP being developed there. Fine. So, let us start with the demonstration. Fine, let us move on to demo. fine. So, so let us look at how we develop these three things which we have identified for the model. Fine. The three things which we have identified for the model, first one is the user info, fine. The second would be the authenticator, fine. The purpose of user info, it is a simple bean. Okay. So, let us start by looking at that user info, and then we will be looking at after user info we will have the authenticator, and then for displaying messages on the login failure or any such, we have a message bean also. So, let us begin with this. And so, okay, so let us start by, we will have a package, fine. So, we have the package for this, fine, package org.epg pathshala.dad.model. So, that is a package where we will have all the model classes, okay, fine. And then we have the we develop a simple bean class. So, this is a public class called user info, okay, fine. And within the body of the user info, we will have the first instance variable as private string name, okay, and then the next one is private string email, fine. And we will also, for a user we are managing name, email, and let us keep the address also, fine. So, let us have the address. So, we have the private string address, fine. A simple bean means we should have the getter and setter methods for this. So, let us develop the getter and setter, fine. So, let us have the get name method. So, this is public string get name, and in the body of the get name we are having return this dot name, okay. And then we have the public void set name. The setter method here takes a string array, fine, it takes a string, and then within the body of this method set name we just set the value of the name, okay. So, this is just simple getter setter methods, right. So, this dot name is equal to n, okay. Then we also have the next one which is for the email. So, we have public string get email, okay, and then within the body of the get email we have return this dot email, okay, fine. And similarly we go for the address. So, we for address we have set, okay, oh, this is a setter for email. So, public void set email, fine, takes string email ID as a parameter, and then it just simply sets the value of the email, this dot email is equal to e. Right. Now, we will also go for, similarly we will have a getter and a setter method for address. So, here is the getter method, public string get address, fine, the body contains simply return this dot address, fine, it just simply returns the value of the variable, okay. And then the setter method for this, so that is the setter, we have public void set address takes a string as a parameter, and then within the body we just simply set the address value. So, this dot address is equal to a, right. So, this is what is going to be our user info class, fine. So, we will have user info, fine, which has the name, email and the address for him, fine. One thing what we are going to do here is we are not going to use any database or anything, fine. So, we will have an authenticator, fine. This we can save, let us save this. So, let us save this as, okay. So, this is user info and there is a package for it. So, let us save here, okay. So, we save it into, we have the EPG Pathshala SRC, fine. So, within this we have the package. So, we have the org EPG Pathshala DAO DAD, and here we have the model, okay, fine. And within the model we will have the class name as user info.java, fine. So, that is what we are saving here, okay, fine. So, we have saved the fine. So, this is one user info. We are not keeping any database anyway. So, let us see what we do for the authenticator, fine. So, for authenticator you could have actually got a database, but here we are not keeping a database. We will have some fixed hard coded username always being returned for a specific hard coded login ID and password, fine. So, this is just for our purpose here, fine, just to see how the MVC actually is to be designed, fine. So, from that point of view you are looking at this, Fine. So, we start with the packet declaration. So, let us have a package. So, we have the package org.epgpathshala.dad.model. Fine. And then the next step is we will have the public class called authenticator. Fine. And within the body of the authenticator, we will have the public boolean authenticate method. The authenticate method would take the login ID and the password. Fine. It simply says true or false. So, this will just say okay, whether this login ID password combination is correct or not. Fine. So, for this, yes, so in this, yeah, we are so within the body what we have done is we have hard coded it. Right. So, here we are saying okay, so if login ID is guessed and if the password is guessed. So, we are just allowing one user whose login ID is guessed and password is guessed. Fine. So, this is just for our this particular experiment which we are doing. Fine. So, in this exercise what we are doing is we are assuming that we will have fine. We are not going with a database here. Fine. Otherwise, yes, it could have been, yes, it could have used a database and fine, things could have been done in by using a database and not hard coding the user ID password here. Okay. Fine. So, anyway, so the that authenticator could just, it is only the authenticator that would have the change, right. The other components won't be affected if you start using a database here. Fine. Okay. So, let us see this. So, this is one method and then okay, we need the user info, right. So, user info is another object which the authenticator should be able to give here. Fine. So, we have a method called get user info. Okay. For a given login ID, it should be able to give us the information about a user. Fine. So, we have this method called get user info, which takes a login ID and returns a user info object. Okay. So, within the body of this, we are just saying if the login ID is guessed. So, only for guessed login ID, fine, we will create an object of if login ID is not guessed, fine, if not the login ID is not guessed, fine, we will return the will return a null value, fine. And then otherwise what we have to do is we create a user info object, okay, fine, and then set the values on it, set the various attributes. So, we will set the name, okay, we will set the email ID, okay, and we will also set the address for him. Okay, fine. So, currently we have set certain values, fine. So, this is and then return that user info object. Okay. So, this is what we have for the authenticator. Fine. So, that is an authenticator. Okay. So, let us save this. Okay. So, we save this into authenticator.java, okay, and that should be under the folder for EPG Pathshala. So, let us try that. Let us go for saving it. Okay. So, we save this as authenticator.java. Okay. So, that is being saved as authenticator.java. Okay, fine. Before we move on, let us try compiling the user info and the authenticator classes, right. So, let us first check for the user info, let us compile that. Okay. So, let us compile like this, we will have. So, for compilation we are saying Java C, destination is the destination would be the classes folder of our application, fine. So, our application is EPG Pathshala. So, within that EPG Pathshala, which comes under the web app folder of Tomcat, fine. So, under EPG Pathshala we have the web-inf folder and there we have the classes folder. Okay. And of course, for the class path you should have your class path set to include your classes folder, fine. And then the servlet API, since okay, we do not need the servlet API since this is only a model. Okay. So, we do not need this. Okay. And let us have the model compiled. So, what do we have in the model? We have the user info.java. So, let us compile this. Okay. So, this compiles fine. Okay, fine. So, Okay. Since we have also created the other class which is the authenticator, let us compile authenticator also. Authenticator was actually dependent on user info, right. So, we have the authenticator also being compiled similarly. Okay. Okay. So, this also compiles, so that is fine. Okay. Now, let us proceed and we just have one more model class to be created, fine. So, the other model class to be created is the one for storing a message, fine. So, here what we have here is we have this okay. So, let us begin with the packet declaration. We have the packet declaration. Okay. So, this is package org.epgpathshala.dad.model, fine. And now we go for developing the class. Okay. So, the class would look like this. We will have what? We will have this as a public class. So, this is public class message bean. Okay. So, that is a bean class. Okay. The end braces, okay, for the class, and then within this, yeah, this is a message bean which will be using for this is needed wherever a message there will be many JSP pages, fine, which will be showing the message, right. So, whenever they want to include message, this would probably be included as part of request attribute, and then the object of message bean is going to be made available to the JSP, fine. So, JSP is going to pick up the properties from this particular message bean. So, in order to have that, right. So, what we are doing is, yes, we are having a class called message bean also. So, simply a message anywhere to be used, yes. So, what we keep here, the name of the bean is message bean, and in this we will just have one instance variable to keep a message that would be of type string. So, we have this instance variable which is a string, and we keep a default value. We do not want to end up with some nulls, right. If someone is trying to display this, or we do not want null pointer exception kind of things. Okay, and therefore, we have some initialization by default also, fine. We do not like it to be null. Okay, fine. And then we so it is an empty string which we are initializing it with. Okay, and then we have what? Okay, it is a just single property. So, we got the getter and setter methods to be created. So, let us create the getter method first. Okay, so, we have the public string get message, fine. The property will be called message now. Okay, get message and braces. Now, we have this would simply return the value of the message. So, return this dot message, okay. And then the setter method for this, okay. Yeah, we have the public void set message takes a string message as a parameter, and then within the fine we have the braces, and then within the body of this we have the setting method. This dot message is equal to messages, fine. So, this is what we have as the message bean, fine. So, we have created the three bean the model classes, fine, the three classes which are part of the model, fine, because yes, in this particular module we are only looking at creating the model part, fine. We have kept the model to be very simple, okay, fine. There is nothing much to be done, since we are only showing a login page, and he goes from login page to the home page if there is a successful login, okay, which will be decided by the authenticator, and then if the fine if there is a if the login is not successful, he is given a error message. Now, for showing that error message, yes, we have here we have got the message bean. Okay. So, let us save this. So, we save this into the model fine the same package. So, we will have the same place, and we will call it as message bean dot java. Okay. So, this is message bean dot java, and now let us compile this. Okay. So, that is message bean dot java to be compiled. It is a very simple one, so it should compile anyway without problems. So, fine, here it compiles here. Okay. So, yeah, so what we have done here in this module? In this module, what we have done is we have created the model classes. What we have already identified is, yes, we have identified the other things also for MVC. In MVC, we will have the model, we will have the, which are the mostly the bean components, and some some more classes which have the logic. Fine. Here we do not have any logic except for authentication. So, we have an authenticator. Fine. But in the subsequent module, fine, we will be developing the controller part and the view part. The view part would be covered by using JSPs. Fine. We already discussed what are the components. Fine. We will have the only two views we are having. We are having a login.jsp, we will have a home.jsp. Those two views will be developed, and of course, we will have to have some servlets being developed as controllers. Fine. The request initially comes to the servlet. So, we will have the controller for. So, we will have a login servlet. Fine. So, whenever someone requests, yes, it hits the login servlet, and login servlet will in turn use the authenticator. Fine. So, we need the authenticator to be already available, right? Okay. Fine. So, the authenticator would be needed by the login servlet. Fine. And we will have whenever the login is successful, and if he is selected, he might like to remember the login ID, fine, a valid login. So, for that purpose, we should be able to check the cookies there, fine, and also later we will be able to other than checking the cookies, we also have the we will use the session. So, we are using cookies, and we will be using the session there, fine. The session would be used for sharing the user info object. So, once someone is logged in, his user info object is created and is available in the session. So, that information, like all these three pieces of information which we have for the user info, that is his name, his email ID and address, can be shown anytime in any of the pages. Right. So, with that idea, we have kept actually the session object in the we have developed the user info, and session object will be storing it. Okay. Fine. So, that is what we have for this module for the time, fine, and now we will have and then we should now be going forward to the next module, which is about developing the controller and the view part. Okay. So, that we will look at in the next module. Thank you. Next module. Thank you. Next module. Thank you. Next module. Thank you. Next module.